The kingdom of Douala was a land of stark contrasts. In its bustling markets, the rich flaunted their wealth, their fine robes trailing through the dust, while the poor watched from the shadows, their stomachs empty, but their spirits unbroken. This was a place where gold spoke louder than justice, and the line between wealth and poverty was so thin, even the wind dared not cross it. But in the heart of this divide, there was a man, one who walked the fine line between fear and hope, chaos and salvation. His name was Dibango, though most knew him by another name, Bel, a name as soft as the morning breeze, yet whispered with the weight of a storm. Bel was no ordinary man. He did not belong to the world of fine robes and gold, nor did he bow to the misery of the streets. He was something else entirely. A thief, yes, but also a giver. A villain to some, but a savior to many. His was a life of shadows and secrets, where every step he took was a challenge to the power that held Douala in its grip. One morning, as the sun rose over the market, Bel stood in the shadows, his sharp eyes scanning the crowd. Merchants boasted of their wealth, their laughter echoing like coins falling into an empty jar. And as one man raised a purse of gold to the sky, Bel moved, silent, swift, and unseen, like a shadow slipping through sunlight. The merchant didn't notice the weight leave his hands, but the boy sitting by the roadside did. Wide-eyed, he watched as Bel pressed a single coin into his small palm, the gesture as quiet as it was kind. The boy didn't speak, but his whisper carried through the alleys. "Thank you, Bel." And as the merchant's shouts of anger rang through the market, the crowd began to murmur. A name passed from one mouth to another, soft as a secret but unstoppable as the tide. Bel was here. And so begins the story of a man who dared to challenge the line between rich and poor. The story of Bel and a love that would change everything. Not far from the bustling market, past the high walls of privilege and wealth, there was another young man whose life could not have been more different from Bel's. His name was Kombi, son of the wealthiest merchant in Douala. To the world, Kombi had everything: luxury, education, and status. But to Kombi, his life felt like a gilded cage. Kombi had spent years studying the world beyond these walls, trade routes, histories of empires, and philosophies of life. But books could not teach him how to bridge the chasm between the rich and the poor. That knowledge lay beyond his reach, in a world he could only observe from a distance. Kombi's father, Mba, was a man of ambition. He had built his fortune through shrewd deals and ruthless tactics, caring little for the lives crushed under the weight of his success. To Mba, Kombi was not just a son, but an heir expected to carry on the legacy of wealth and power. Meanwhile, in the alleys of the poor district, whispers of a new plan began to spread. Bel, the shadow who stole from the rich to give to the poor, had set his sights on Mba. The merchant's fortune was built on the suffering of many, and Bel knew the time had come to take it back. In the light of day, Douala seemed untouched by the storm brewing beneath its surface. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, two lives were on a collision course, one bound by duty, the other by rebellion. Kombi and Bel, two men from different worlds, were about to meet in the most unexpected way. The night was still, the kind of stillness that made even the richest man feel uneasy. In Mba's estate, lanterns flickered, casting long shadows against high walls as guards patrolled with the confidence of men who had never known fear. They didn't expect that tonight their master's fortress would be breached. While the wealthy slept soundly in their silk-draped beds, Bel moved through the darkness like a whisper carried by the wind. His gang followed closely, each step silent, each breath steady. For weeks, they had watched the estate, studied its rhythms, and tonight they struck. Bell was the first to slip through the gates, his movements as precise as a dancer's. The guards never saw him coming. One by one, they fell, subdued with the skill of a man who had done this 100 times before. No blood was spilled. That was Bell's rule. Fear was a far better weapon than violence. Inside the mansion, Combi sat in his study, oblivious to the danger creeping closer. A single lantern lit the room as he pored over maps and scrolls, his thoughts far away. Combi liked the quiet of the night. It gave him space to dream of a world beyond these walls. The door swung open, breaking the silence. Combi looked up, startled. At first he thought it was one of the servants, but the figure that entered was not someone he recognized. Tall, broad-shouldered and cloaked in the night shadows, Bell stood in the doorway, his piercing gaze locking onto Combi. "You," Bell said, his voice low but commanding, "you're coming with me." Combi rose to his feet, his heart pounding in his chest. "Who are you? What do you want?" he demanded, his voice steadier than he felt. Bell stepped forward, his presence filling the room. "I'm Bell," he said boldly, his eyes never leaving Combi. "And I'm here to kidnap you for ransom." For a moment, Combi's eyes widened in recognition. Though he had never seen Bell before, the name was one he had heard countless times. Whispers in the halls of the rich and stories told by those who had felt the sting of Bell's raids. Bell was the most feared and talked about man in the kingdom. His reputation preceded him, though few had ever laid eyes on the notorious gang leader. Combi's heart skipped a beat as panic gripped him, but he forced himself to swallow it. He wasn't a man who gave in easily. Despite the fear twisting in his gut, he stood taller, straightened his back and said, "Well, let's get this over with," his voice steady, though his heart raced beneath the calm exterior. Bell's lips twitched, almost into a smirk. He admired the young man's nerve, though he wouldn't admit it. "Brave," he muttered, "but foolish." He gestured to his men, who entered the room and moved quickly to bind Combi's hands. As they led Combi out into the night, the chill of the air bit at his skin. The estate, once a place of comfort and safety, now seemed cold and unfamiliar. Combi glanced back at the towering walls of his home, their height suddenly insignificant. For the first time in his life, he felt utterly powerless. Bell walked ahead, his stride purposeful, his mind focused on the task. He told himself Combi was just a pawn in his plan, another piece in the game he played against the rich. But as the young man's footsteps echoed behind him, Bell couldn't help but glance back just once. The look in Combi's eyes, confused, angry, and proud, stayed with him longer than he cared to admit. The journey to Bell's hideout was long and shrouded in darkness. Combi, his hands bound and his pride wounded, was led through narrow alleys and hidden paths that twisted like the veins of the kingdom itself. The air grew colder with each step, the sounds of the bustling city fading into silence. Bell walked ahead, his figure cutting through the night like a blade, while Combi stumbled behind, his mind racing with questions. When they finally arrived, Combi was struck by the starkness of the place. The hideout was no grand fortress, no lavish lair fit for a villain of Bell's reputation. It was a repurposed warehouse on the edge of the poor district, its walls weathered and cracked, its corners lit by dim lanterns. A fire burned in the center of the room, throwing flickering shadows on the faces of Bell's gang. They were young, scrappy, and dangerous looking, but their eyes held something more than menace, something closer to loyalty. Combi was pushed forward, his shoulders tense as he took in the scene. He had imagined criminals as brutes, unthinking and cruel, but what he saw here was different. These people moved with purpose, their hands quick and practiced as they counted coins, mended weapons, and prepared meals over the fire. This was no gang, it was a family. "Sit," Bell ordered, his voice interrupting Combi's thoughts. A chair was dragged forward, and Combi was forced into it. He glanced up at Bell, whose sharp eyes seemed to pierce right through him. There was no kindness in that gaze, but there was no malice either, only curiosity. "You're quiet," Bell said, leaning against a table with casual authority. "I expected more fight from the son of Ember." Combi straightened his back, refusing to look away. "I have nothing to say to a thief." The gang chuckled at his defiance, but Bell's expression didn't change. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, as if considering something. "A thief," he repeated, his tone laced with mockery. "Tell me, Combi, where do you think your father's wealth comes from?" Combi's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Bell took a step closer, his presence commanding the room. "You sit here in your fine clothes, fed by the labor of people who can barely afford bread, and you call me a thief?" He smirked, though there was no humor in it. "If I'm a thief, then your father is a king among criminals." The words stung, not because Combi believed them, but because they forced him to confront a thought he had spent years trying to ignore. He looked away, his silence earning another round of chuckles from the gang. "Leave him," Bell said, waving a hand. "We'll deal with him in the morning." The gang dispersed, their footsteps fading into the corners of the hideout. Bell lingered for a moment, his eyes still on Combi. Then with a shrug he turned and walked away. Combi exhaled, his shoulders relaxing slightly now that Bell's piercing gaze was gone. He looked around the room, searching for an escape route, but the doors were guarded and the windows too high to reach. He leaned back in the chair, his mind a storm of worry. Had his father been alerted to his kidnapping yet? How long was this criminal going to keep him? How long until he could return home, if they ever let him go? In the far corner of the room, Bell sat by the fire, sharpening a blade. He didn't look at Combi, but the merchant's son stayed in his peripheral vision. Combi was different from anyone Bell had ever encountered. He was proud, defiant, and unshaken by the power Bell wielded over him. And yet, there was a vulnerability in his eyes that Bell couldn't quite place. Neither man slept that night, though neither would admit it. One stared at the ceiling, trying to make sense of the chaos he had been thrown into. The other watched the fire, his mind circling questions he had no interest in answering. And so, in the silence of the hideout, their worlds began to shift, inch by inch. Morning came slowly to the hideout. The first rays of sunlight seeped through the cracks in the wooden walls, tracing faint lines of gold across the room. Combi stirred in the chair where he had spent the night, his muscles aching from the awkward position. He blinked against the light, disoriented for a moment, before the events of the previous night came rushing back. His eyes scanned the room, now alive with movement. Bell's gang moved with the same efficiency Combi had observed the night before. Pots clanged as breakfast was prepared over the fire, and soft conversations filled the air. Despite their rough appearances, there was an ease to their movements, a sense of camaraderie that Combi couldn't ignore. It was a sharp contrast to the cold, calculated routines of his father's estate. And then there was Bell. He stood by a table, his presence commanding even when he wasn't speaking. His sharp eyes swept over the room, taking in every detail, every movement. For the first time, in the daylight and without the panic of the previous night clouding his thoughts, Combi truly saw him. Bell was good-looking in a way that one couldn't miss, his rich dark skin glowing in the soft morning light and his features strikingly bold. Sharp cheekbones, full lips, and a strong jawline that spoke of strength and dominance. When Bell's gaze briefly landed on Combi, Combi quickly looked away, his heart skipping for reasons he didn't care to examine. "You're awake," Bell said, his voice commanding attention over the murmurs in the room. He walked toward Combi, carrying a wooden bowl. Without a word, he set it down on the table in front of him. Steam rose from the bowl, the scent of eggs filling the air. Combi glanced at the bowl, then back at Bell. "What's this? A bribe?" Bell raised an eyebrow, his lips twitching into the faintest hint of a smirk. "Call it breakfast. You'll need your strength." "For what?" Combi asked, his tone sharper than he intended. "For whatever comes next," Bell replied simply, his smirk fading as he stepped back. "Eat or don't. It's your choice." Combi hesitated. He wanted to refuse out of principle, but his stomach betrayed him, growling loudly in the quiet. Flustered, he picked up the bowl and ate a small spoonful, refusing to meet Bell's gaze. The eggs were plain but warm, and Combi hated how much he appreciated it. Bell didn't linger. He returned to the table where his gang gathered, discussing their next move in hushed tones. Combi watched him out of the corner of his eye, studying the way he carried himself. Calm, confident, and always in control. There was something infuriating about Bell's ease, about the way he seemed to own every room he walked into. And yet, Combi couldn't look away for long. The day stretched on, each hour heavy with uncertainty. Combi was left mostly alone, the gang too busy with their own tasks to bother with him. He tried to gather his thoughts, to come up with a plan to escape, but his mind kept drifting back to Bell. The way he spoke, the way he moved, the strange, quiet way he seemed to watch over everything. By afternoon, Bell approached Combi again, his expression unreadable. "Your father will pay," he said, his tone matter of fact. "Men like him always do." Combi straightened in his chair, his defiance returning. "You think this will change anything? You take his gold, but he'll make it back. Men like you don't change the world. You only survive in it." Bell's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond immediately. Instead, he leaned down, his face close enough that Combi could see the faint scars along his jawline. "Surviving is a victory for people like me. You wouldn't understand." Combi's breath caught. He wanted to argue, to hold his ground, but something about Bell's voice, low, steady, and laced with something deeper than anger, made him pause. For the first time, Combi wondered what it was like to live in Bell's world, a world where survival was the only currency that mattered. As Bell stepped away, Combi felt a strange, unnameable tension settle over him. He told himself it was frustration, anger, or even fear. But as he watched Bell walk back to the fire, his movements confident and unbothered, Combi couldn't shake the feeling that it was something else entirely. Toward evening, Bell ordered his men to remove the bindings on Combi's hands and feet. Seeing this as an opportunity, Combi waited until the gang was distracted. With a deep breath, he darted toward the open doorway, his heart pounding with the desperate thrill of potential freedom. For a moment, he thought he might actually make it, but it was only a moment. 2 gang members sprang into action, cutting off his path and grabbing his arms with unyielding force. Bell, leaning casually against the far wall with his arms crossed, didn't move to intervene. He just stood there, watching the scene unfold with a faint smirk, his expression betraying nothing more than mild amusement. It was the kind of look an adult gives a child wasting its time, and it made Combi's blood boil. Combi twisted and kicked, but the gang members held firm, their rough grip a stark reminder of how futile his escape attempt had been. As they dragged him back into the room, Bell's gaze never wavered, the calm indifference in his posture cutting deeper than any words. By the time the struggle ended, Combi's chest heaved with effort and his arm throbbed from an injury sustained during the scuffle. To Combi's confusion, Bell did not scold him. yell at him, or punish him as he had expected. Instead, Bell pushed off the wall and approached. Wordlessly, he pulled out a first aid kit and knelt beside Combi. His face remained impassive, sharp with irritation, but his hands moved deftly and gently as he cleaned and dressed the wound on Combi's leg. The strange contradiction in Bell's actions only left Combi more frustrated. How could a man be so infuriatingly indifferent one moment and unexpectedly careful the next? When Bell finished dressing the wound, he met Combi's gaze with an adamant look. "Don't bother trying to escape again," he said flatly. "You can't. The moment your father pays the ransom, you're free to go. Until then, you're staying here." Combi, still reeling from the strange moment of care, hesitated before asking, "What's taking him so long to pay?" He tried to hide his fear. He had expected his father to pay immediately, to do anything to secure his release. Bell shrugged and said, "He's digging his heels in. You'd think a father would do anything for his only son and heir, but instead, your father is playing games." The words sat on Combi's chest like a boulder. He forced himself to remain composed, though disappointment threatened to suffocate him. He told himself there must be a reason, that his father wasn't deliberately putting his life at risk, but doubt crept in, quiet and insistent. Bell handed Combi a blanket and simply said, "Get comfortable. It looks like you're going to be here for a while." Thank you for watching. Stay tuned for the next part and don't forget to like, share, and comment.